Hello, this is Wade Frazier. This is January 22nd, 2026, 4:44 p.m. So this post is going to, I guess, the continuation of these posts I'm making. And it's going to cover the time of when Dennis's kit sales program, informational kits, began working till we were rated. So we'll cover that. And now that's 4 months, I suppose, something like that. 4 month period. Well, what a 4 month period. And by the time his program began working, again, I had been with him 16, 17 months by that time. And I hadn't seen anything but bloody ruin that far. And by the time the program began working, my stress problems were back. I drank too much. And my guess is I survived because of my youth and relatively healthy diet. Well, I survived all that. And in the end, it was my idealism in youth is why I survived my adventures in my first stint with Dennis. So soon after Dennis did his dowsing, gesture of how he thought this was the next big one, it was. And we soon became buried in orders for our kits. And we started hiring. And again, within 2 months, we had 40 employees. And then we rented out a second building. I haven't seen anything like it before or since. Interestingly, before we really got going, in fact, when we came to California from Boston, Dennis brought along a unit or two. It was heat pump. And when we got there, Wayne, Mr. Professor, one of his buddies was a guy named Jerry Hipple. And Jerry had a ranch in nearby Carpinteria that he ran with his son. And Jerry raised orchids and had this big greenhouse. And raising orchids, even in Southern California, you need to have a greenhouse and a heated greenhouse because all these orchids need, they always have to be above 70 or something, or else they die, some number like that. So orchid growers have to have these very, precise environmental conditions in order to do it. And Jerry, he started coming by like every day to our office. We had a few guys like him. They kind of became a nuisance. And one day, after a couple weeks of this, Dennis said, "Jerry, I like you, and we're busy. If you want to buy something, we're here we're here. But if not, we're really busy, so we just can't chat with you every day." And Jerry got the message, and so he bought one of our units from us. I think for about $4,000, as I recall, and that included the panels, the whole thing, and I think the direct cost was maybe $2,000 to make that. And again, these were units that were manufactured in Dennis's factory in Seattle. Ended up there in Southern California. He and his son installed it, and as I discussed in previous videos, it's a crapshoot to have the buyers install it themselves. It usually needs to be professionally done, and maybe they did use professionals. I like to think I hope they did. I don't know, but it turned out that it was a great installation, and it immediately began saving them over $5,000 a year in their heating costs. Yeah, so it replaced gas heating, and so it paid for itself in a year. And this is one of the examples I've referred to in the past of these things can pay for itself in a year. So, wow. So, and it was a beautiful installation. And it actually became our showcase installation there in '87 as people from around the world came to visit us. In fact, I once took a prospective kit buyer over there and to see that heat pump in action. Again, it wasn't sexy. Again, it didn't move, but it was sure evident on your energy bills as they plummeted. Also, in those days, and this was September, again, late August, early September, something like that. And somewhere in there, and by that time, so I saw what I see. I saw three attempts that I know of to steal Dennis's business there in Seattle. One was successful. We had the guy that Dennis hired to run the Boston operation tried to steal it. And once just as we started getting going, there were a few attempts to steal it, steal the company. And there's many ways to steal a company. You don't have to steal their stock. There's other to steal their customers. There's all sorts of ways to try to steal a company. And one I remember in particular was a guy who was some patriarch of some kind of quasi cult thing, and Dennis was Christian, very loud Christian, and so he attracted those kind of types. And so there was a guy who was a patriarch of some kind of Christian slash cultist movement. I remember he tried to steal it. And one day, after this attempt became evident, of course, unsuccessful, but once I'd seen it again, I don't know, 7, 8, 9, 10, some numbers, after several attempts. One day I told Dennis, I said, Dennis, this is really shocking to see all these people trying to steal our company. And Dennis's response was, the first 50 times I saw it, I was shocked too. And so I was losing my naivete quickly in those days. And yeah, it was always something. And again, it was my journey's primary lesson is personal integrity is the world's scarcest commodity. And I resisted that lesson every step of the way until it was beaten into my head in no uncertain terms. And within a year or so of that, I expressed that, I finally learned my lesson. Yeah, personal integrity is truly the world's scarcest commodity, but it's also its most precious. And it's the key. So personal integrity is the key to save the world. That's the only thing that we really need, is that. Everything else is secondary. And that's what I learned. That was my primary lesson during my days with Dennis. And the thieves. And so Dennis, in fact, he wrote, he goes, "I never been had by a man I didn't like." And it was his way of saying the thieves are always nice guys. They're all, in fact, the only way they get close enough to stick their dagger in your ribs is to be nice guys. Yeah, if there were these abrasive, mobster-looking guys, Dennis wouldn't let them get close. But it's always these nice guys who would stick their dagger in Dennis's ribs when his back was turned. And I call it the amiable psychopath trick, right? So psychopaths have this superficial charm, and again, they make great salesmen, politicians, and CEOs, and I've seen that game many times now. I've seen the amiable psychopath and the tricks they play. And I've had people tell me, "Oh, these criminals, I can spot them a mile away. I have this ability. I can see how their eye twitches or something when they're lying." And it's like, no, you can't. These people are good. Yeah, so the people I saw sicked on us, man, they look just like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, look like Mr. Rogers, act like Mr. Rogers, until they took out their sword and try to hack you in two with it. Yeah, until you've actually seen that in action and watch these people in action, it's hard to believe. But it's in this field, it became very common, agonizingly, disgustingly common on our journey. Last year, again, the hitman who was sicked on Dennis's company, Bill Delp, who worked for the Bonneville Power Administration. Once I learned he died, then I could name him, and I did. And he was a killer. And the Substack post that accompanies this, I linked to his obituary and all the eulogies of what a great guy Bill was. Yeah, so he duped, he easily duped everybody around him, and this is typical. That autumn, I believe, is when Ken Hodgel bought his kit. I think it was that autumn before the raid, and he looked and acted like Mr. Rogers, and he's the one who who led the theft of the company there after Dennis got arrested. And he looked just, and again, the people he duped, I was stunned by the people he was able to dupe. Yeah, again, if you haven't been around this, it's easy to get duped. So I'd seen that show too many times. So anyway, yeah, when he made his move, in a nanosecond, I knew what he was up to. The people around me weren't, and they scoffed, and that'll come later. Dennis also got those encouraging phone calls in the night. So between the time I became his partner and Dennis got arrested, he got 3 or 4 of those phone calls. Phone calls in the night, usually on a private line, supposedly only his wife supposedly had, and it would be, "Mr. Lee, we're really impressed with what you're doing. Keep up the good work," and then hang up. And I came to realize that was the so-called white hats, dissident faction of the global elite. And yeah, we had our encounters with both factions eventually. Again, and that we knew it. So at first you don't know you're interacting with who you're interacting with or why, but eventually you learn. And as soon as we got going, Stan, so also known as Mr. Engineer, the guy who built Dennis's factory in Seattle, lived with us in Boston. He lived with us for about 5 months in that house. I lived on the 3rd floor, and Stan and Dennis, his wife, and their children lived on the 2nd floor. He lived with us for about 5 months, and he came out with us. And once we visited Amway, then Stan went on to Ellensburg with his stepson and waited for us. And so once we started getting going again, we brought Stan down again. So there he was in the saddle with us once again. And as I've mentioned in previous posts, I did not know until I read it in one of Dennis's books that the reason we moved to Ventura was so Dennis could work with my mentor. And they didn't tell me that. In fact, I remember Dennis telling me once they didn't tell me stuff. And later on, I learned what it was, what some of the stuff was that they wouldn't tell me. They figured I was too young and impressionable. I don't know, but they didn't tell me, which costed me a lot in the end, but I didn't know. And so, yeah, so my mentor didn't get involved initially. For the first couple of months, really, he really didn't get involved. And then Stan, though, so Stan was down, he was with us, and he and my mentor got along famously. A couple old engineers, a couple of gray-haired engineers that got along like 2 engineers. And so, yeah, they became really close. And actually, what happened was one day, and this is, I believe, in September, Dennis went to visit an inventor in Los Angeles. He brought Stan with him, and they brought my mentor with him to assess it. And again, my mentor was a shareholder, right, in the operation, so we used his ability. And so anyway, what I heard was that during the drive to Los Angeles and back, Dennis brought up the issue of what was going on with Mr. Mentor? Why wasn't he getting involved? And he said, "Well, Dennis, I heard you don't treat inventors very well." And my mentor had been screwed over every time. All of his inventions were suppressed or stolen. So his gun shyness was understandable. But Stan had been with Dennis for several years by that time. And he told my mentor, he goes, "Dennis treats inventors better than anybody I ever saw." Yeah, so he certainly never screwed an inventor over. And that assurance was good enough. So my mentor came aboard. And our business was skyrocketing at the time. And I was just trying to hold on for dear life. And I said it was like holding on to a rope tied onto a rocket that was taking off. That was one wild ride trying to go from a few volunteers to 40 employees in a couple of months. That was wild. And I was busy, so I didn't really have much time for and I don't think they want me involved anyway, so I didn't really hear much about the technical engineering side of the business. Uh, yeah, Mr. Mentor, he was, and once he got involved, that's their world. And I mean, I would have loved to have been a part of that, but I didn't have the time. So I was too busy trying to make the business run. Uh, well, my mentor, soon after he came aboard, he actually sat Stan and Dennis down and presented him his idea for doing free energy. And what his idea was to take the panels from Dennis's heat pump and marry them to his hydraulic heat engine. And he thought that free energy could be produced that way. And I'll be the first to admit that if you study thermodynamics 101, the second law of thermodynamics says that such a device should not be able to work. Yeah, it's like the second law says you can't do that. However, and Dennis's original idea was naive. This was a more sophisticated version, I would say. And from the very beginning, we started hearing from scientists, even thermodynamicists, who said, "Well, and I keep hearing this from scientists. The second law is not what is presented as," and I've heard it many times. And I linked to it in my Substack, but one was Eugene Malov, and he was like, "Yeah, the second law is garbage." And so, anyway, so I saw a lot of scientists and thermodynamicists saying, "Well, maybe that could work." Well, the only way to know is to find out, right? Build it. So we built a machine shop in the back of that warehouse, and we began building a prototype of my mentor's engine. And so we were working on it. So we were going after free energy and selling the information kits on the world's best heating system. And I'll say it now. In fact, Dennis, maybe it was in Boston, maybe Ventura, but Dennis said all he ever wanted when he got involved with that heat pump was to build an industry around it. That's what he wanted to see, an industry around it. And that's really what I wanted. I wanted to build equipment, sell equipment, put it on homes, put it on businesses, watch it save so much energy. That's what I wanted to do. I never got the chance to, which was, yeah, that's the one, I wish I could have been a part of that. But if I had, we would live in the fifth epoch today, because if we had not been attacked in Ventura, we would have delivered free energy eventually. And I'll get into that more later. So again, the machinist we brought out from Massachusetts, he started building a prototype of my mentor's engine there in Ventura. And Dennis then, I mean, he was always enthusiastic, but he started going into orbit in those days. Yeah, we were on this trajectory like this. And and that salesman buddy of his from Yakima, who ran the Boston operation into the ground and had to, repossess the car that he stole, etc. He came down. So Dennis brought him back down to Ventura. And I guess, and anyway, and so he was down there in Ventura, and actually, this was a friend from Dennis's youth, and so what happened in those days? This is now the autumn of '87. Dennis and that salesman would work in the office late at night and watch movies. So they were selling videotapes. We had videotape players and stuff, so they'd rent movies and watch them. They'd be drinking and having a good time. In fact, it was the most fun I saw Dennis have ever, I think, was when he was hanging out with his friend there in Yakima. So I'm happy for that. That it was kind of a happy time for Dennis. And I was working. As soon as I started taking off, I was working 70-hour weeks once again. So yeah, most of my career was 50 to 60-hour weeks in 70s. This was no way to live, but that was the reality. In fact, so in those days, I remember doing 70-hour. In fact, I even did an all-nighter or two, trying to keep up with the explosive growth. And we soon ran out of space. So that building, in fact, I gave an estimate of 5,000 square feet of our original facility. I looked it up yesterday. It's only 3,400 square feet. And we outgrew it again. A couple of months we outgrew it, and then we rented the building next door, and that was another 6,000 square feet. So we had over 9,000 square feet of facility with again 40 employees in it. And I moved my office to the new building. So my office so I was constantly walking back and forth between the buildings. In fact, there was another business that had half of the building that our original office was in, and that was between us. So anyway, I was constantly walking back and forth between the buildings, to run the company. So with Dennis's wife Allison. Yeah, Allison and I were really the ones who were running all the administrative part of that company. That was some kind of fun. Uh, and also what happened, and this is something that I think a lot of my viewers, part of what they came for, was we became a global mecca in there in the autumn of '87. And I've only heard of a couple attempts like what we did, only a couple, and they met similar fates. Actually, not as grim a fate as ours did, but yeah, nobody really tried to do this before we were doing, and so we had people coming from all over the world to visit our office. I remember a Japanese trade official came to visit Dennis in his office. And I was busy working. I was working all these crazy hours, and then all these people who visited, I didn't have time to talk to them all. And in fact, Dennis became very hard to get to. So he became this, yeah, he people were trying to get his time, and they weren't able to get it because Dennis was busy. And and people were trying to get to Dennis through me. And so I ended up taking phone calls. That were people who wish they would. They wish they could have talked to Dennis, but ended up talking to me instead. And this was happening. And one day, and again, this is a fun anecdote. One of the few really fun ones I have, I think, was I got a phone call from a guy who had some exotic propulsion technology that he was, I think, trying to get involved with. This, be my guess. And I can't remember where that went. Probably nowhere, but I don't know. I think that was probably the case. And during the phone call, he told me that when he was a young man, he had occasion to call Princeton's physics department. This is back in the 50s. And I don't know, people who know much about Albert Einstein knows that he worked for the Institute of Advanced Studies there. It was near Princeton, but actually they didn't have their own facility, so they used Princeton's physics department in those days. And when this guy was a young man, he had occasion to call Princeton's physics department. And somebody picked up the phone and said, "This is Albert." Oh, what days of innocence, right? Yeah. So Albert Einstein picks up the phone that was ringing there in Princeton's physics department. And this man told me that the conversation quickly turned into Einstein's quasi-mystical wonderment at the universe's mysteries. Yeah, Einstein was out there, so Einstein, it was quite a conversation he was having with Einstein. And so anyway, that was interesting to hear that. And by that time, again, we had 40 employees, and one of them became Dennis's assistant. Dennis hired an assistant, a guy named Cab. And Cab was the one who ended up running interference for Dennis, a lot of people who wanted Dennis's time. And Cab was actually a former sheriff's deputy, a harbor master, as I recall. And so he was in law enforcement, but he had gotten out, and there he was as Dennis's assistant. And so people ended up talking to Cab a lot, who were trying to get to Dennis. And I think this one came through Cab. And so again, there was a small little group of us that were privy to all this stuff, that were hearing these stories, etc. And anyway, so I heard that I think it was Cab who had this encounter. So at our office one day, a limousine showed up. So a limousine showed up at our office, and some man gets out and he goes to try to talk to Dennis, and well, he can't get in and see Dennis, but he talks to Cab. So he talks to Cab. And this is the story he told. So he said he was an entrepreneur, a businessman who became a tycoon. His net worth was $400 million. And now we're going back. This is now 1987, so that would be equivalent of billions of dollars today. So today he would be called a billionaire. Man, he made his fortune. So he made his fortune, was set for life, obviously, but you didn't want to just sit around and play all the time. So he still wanted to do things productive with his life. So what he did, and I think this was in the 1970s, maybe 80s, but my guess is the late 70s, he built a windmill farm in the American Southwest. I think one of the early ones. It might have been Arizona. I'm trying to remember. It's been a long time ago, but it might have been Arizona. And he was probably planning on selling electricity from the windmills to electric companies. I think that's what he was planning on doing. And back then, there were actually windmills that were kind of scams to get tax breaks, et cetera. But this guy was serious. This was something that he really wanted to make this work happen. And so he actually sunk $35 million of his own money in building this windmill farm. And he was working late at night. And one day he gets a phone call. Like Dennis would get those late night phone calls. This guy got a late night phone call, a different kind of late night phone call. And so the caller made a proposal. The caller said, here's the deal. You can pack up your briefcase and leave the facility and never return, or your family will be dead by dawn. What's it going to be? And the caller provided information that made it clear that he was serious and could deliver on his threat. So the entrepreneur hangs up the phone and actually takes out his calculator. And he goes, 35 million divided by 400 million. And he had invested 9% of his net worth in this windmill farm. And he looked at the numbers, he thought about the phone call, and he said, it's not worth it. So he packed up his briefcase, left the facility, and never returned. And when he finished this conversation, he told Cab, he goes, I wish you guys the best. I really hope you guys succeed, but you have no idea what you're up against. And that was not the last time I've heard of deals like that. Yeah, so these guys, the global elites and these energy gangsters, they played hardball, super hardball back then. They're not as murderous as they used to be. And I'll be discussing that at another time probably, but they're not as murderous as they used to be. In fact, after 1990, it got to be somehow after the Soviet Union collapsed, they stopped being as violent. And I don't know why, but this is what I've heard. Another man that came to our office. I think I heard about this from my mentor. And man came to our office. And he was once a business partner of a man who was a professor at Cal State San Bernardino. This is in the outskirts of the LA basin. In fact, where this air pollution is awesome. At least it was when I was young. And the professor was a chemist, and he had invented a method to extract platinum from ore that was considered unminable. And so it was efficiencies that had never been seen before in extracting platinum, which could have disrupted the platinum market, I would say. And they looked for investors, so they were like, "Hey, this is a great invention. This should be great. It's going to revolutionize the platinum industry, etc." And they were looking for money, and they took money from Eastern oligarchy types, the East Coast kind, Eastern oligarchy, same people who probably murdered Jack Kennedy. So these guys, this guy who was partners with this professor, they bought some land out in the California desert, and they were getting down to it. They were starting their mining operation, and the first results were extraordinary. Yeah, it was going to work. So these guys were going to be, the new platinum tycoons. And just as they began their mining operation, suddenly the cops were beating their door down for violating some law from the 19th century nobody ever heard about. And these guys realized they had been had. They knew that something was up, and they fled. And the professor's truck was actually found in the desert, abandoned, and he was never seen again. And the man who came to our office and told us this tale said he lived in the back of a chiropractor's office for 2 years, hiding to stay alive. And the Eastern oligarchy ended up owning the mine. Uh, and so these are the kinds of stories that people were coming to our office to tell us. Another story I heard then was a free energy inventor, actually. So we started hearing about free energy inventors eventually. And here was a free energy inventor whose family was murdered. They murdered his family. And then they have a coup de grace where they murder the people, and then they set the house on fire, and then they bulldoze it. And I heard of this strategy later. So yeah, setting a house on fire and bulldozing was a go-to move for these people. Yeah, so this is the kind of viciousness, the murderousness of these people. Another visitor, I remember, talked about his battle with the federal government. They tried to seize his patent under the national security laws, and so this is Stephen Greer, his 9 methods of suppression. This is one of them, where they classify you apply for a patent and they classify it and they take it away from you under national security laws. And this guy had invented some disruptive energy technology, and the government tried to seize it using the national security laws. And he was in a protracted legal battle, I think years-long legal battle against the federal government, trying to prevent it. I don't know how it worked out, but he actually was. So he did fight back. So he actually was in. He had a running a legal action to try to prevent them from doing that. I bet the government prevailed. I don't know. Or he came to a grim end. You know, they have quite a bag of tricks to wipe out these kind of upstarts. And I had heard about that actually before that. So my mentor, he told me, because he worked for the Navy, he told me that classifying patents was easily done. In fact, he said it wasn't even that high-ranking of official that could sign the secrecy order. So the seizure order, I think it was maybe bird colonel, which is a colonel rank. I think it could go that low to actually an official can sign something to say we're going to seize this in the name of national security. So yeah, he said it's not hard. Again, it's also corrupt. That yeah, it's easy to get an official to sign something like that. Properly induced, with a little grease palming in a offshore bank account, etc. So, and I'm sure that I only heard of a fraction of the stories that came to our office. But this was something, in fact, I have more to tell. So I heard of plenty firsthand also. And so those will come later. What I didn't mention in my previous posts, in fact, my Boston post, is this Blake the Installer guy who built our demo model for our greatest energy shows. Again, he went to work for the thieves in Seattle immediately after the company was stolen. In fact, when I eventually saw Dennis, the accounting records, I compared their records, etc. In '86, I saw that he never missed a paycheck. So I was working for free for months and Blake's getting a paycheck the whole time. And I didn't begrudge it to him. Again, he was fixing systems that were poorly installed in the rush to get everything in by December 31, '85. So, I was, I'm happy he did that work. But he was a mercenary. But he was a competent mercenary. And so, yeah, he got paid. Dennis paid him while nobody else was getting paid except Bob, the inventor. And then he went to work for the thieves and they paid him, I'm sure. I'm sure he probably took cash in advance for some of that. And so he's a mercenary. And but he was a competent mercenary. And after he came out and built our demo model, Dennis wanted to come back out again. And the first time he had me do it, so he used my relationship with Blake to get him to come out, and it was fine. It was a fine thing. And then the second time, before he had me do it, he actually had his wife call Blake, and yeah, Blake was looking for work also, permanent work. So I don't know exactly. It was going to be a delicate negotiation to get him to come out, and Dennis's wife wasn't delicate, so. She had a conversation with him, and it was some kind of blow up, and it was like mutual disdain society or something. So he wasn't going to come do it. And then Dennis, he had me call Blake then. After I'm supposed to come in the ruins now and try to salvage it. I don't know. But anyway, so Dennis, he had me, I called Blake. In fact, it was at our home, and Blake was, yeah, Allison had definitely, Blake was, there's no way he was going to work for us again. And Dennis made me, while I was on the phone, he said, tell him he's not going to work in the industry again if he doesn't come. Oh, and I didn't want to do that. And so I said, yeah, this is what Dennis is telling me, that you're done in the industry if you don't want to do this. That was, Blake did not take that well, very understandably. And I told Dennis after the call, I said, I'm not delivering your threats anymore. I'm not going to do that. And so, but the reality was Dennis was the industry. And so, yeah, Blake never did work in the industry again because there was no industry after Dennis got wiped out. So, but that was one of the not so fun parts. One of the many not so fun parts of those days. And Blake, to this day, he's a refrigeration mechanic. He had a little business. In fact, taught refrigeration at a college for a while, etc. So, anyway, and Blake eventually got his vengeance, or at least tried to, and that's coming. And Dennis, Dennis brought Stan back. He tried to get me to bring Bob the inventor back into the operation. And when we started exploding there in Ventura, Dennis called up his head salesman there in Seattle. The guy's name was Dave. And Dave, again, he was one of the so-called loyalists when the company was stolen. But Dave was definitely the most harsh. He seemed like a brawler to me, kind of. So I wasn't sure about this Dave guy. But Dennis, he became Dennis's leading sales guy. And Dennis, he had a strategy. So Dennis trained salespeople. And one of his strategies was he had a group of salespeople, and he'd turn one of them into what he called a winner to inspire the others. And so Dennis did that. He did that with Dave in Seattle. So Dave was just, and as I said before, Dennis's marketing plan was the magic. And it was so brilliant that a chimpanzee could sell his heat pump. They're basically giving it away. And so, and what would happen is that he turned, Dave into a winner, and basically giving away the heat pump. And I saw this where Dennis's salesmen would be selling this stuff, and they were, how to say it, they thought it was their brilliance that was at work, and it wasn't. It was Dennis's plan was so brilliant that it wasn't hard to sell this stuff. Yeah, Dennis's genius was the magic. It wasn't these salespeople he was rounding up. And so we could have unintended results where these salesmen got an inflated sense of importance. But Dennis said to Dave, he said, come on down to Seattle and check out our operation and see if you want to start making the big money again, Dave. And then we paid for it. We flew him down. In fact, on Saturday morning. So I spent my valuable 7-hour-a-week time. I spent a Saturday morning driving to the LA airport to pick Dave up. I picked him up, took him back to Ventura, and he met Dennis and saw the operation, etc. And I think it was the same night maybe we sent him back. And Dennis I don't know what Dave was at the time. I had no idea what Dave was thinking. It's like, was he impressed? Was he not? I don't know. But a week or two after that trip to Ventura from Dave, we received in the mail an extortion claim, basically, from from Dave, inventor Bob, Blake, and that engineer buddy of his, Brian, who was an idiot. He couldn't think past his textbooks, So these four guys, and these are the loyalists, right? These are four of the so-called good guys, and they were making a claim against us, a threat basically. And it was mostly based on Bob's wild calculation of what he thought he was owed. And they demanded $250,000. So, and it was a ludicrous claim with, again, they had no standing to make that kind of, they had nothing really to go on. It was ludicrous. And so, Blake never missed a paycheck. Bob never missed a paycheck. And I was sorry for what happened to Bob, but it was, anyway, so we got this $250,000 demand, and we just laughed, threw it aside and laughed at it. And I was, again, more of my journey's primary lesson was being taught to me in no gentle fashion. yeah, so these guys were trying to extort $250,000 from us. It was pretty low. In fact, again, Dave's trip was, I'm sure, it was a scouting trip to see if they thought we had it or not. So it was really just, yeah, it was really low for Dave to do that. And yeah, not only spending my Saturday doing, helping him out, etc., but then in the end they try to stab us in the back. So in the end, only two of the loyalists in Ventura and Seattle really went out honorably. Only two of them did. And I've actually tried to contact both of them. And I don't know if I mentioned this before, but here a few years ago, I tried to contact people who actually had acquitted themselves honorably in my journey with Dennis. And there were several of them. And people I thought, were buds. I saw them, as far as I knew, they actually bowed out honorably. And particularly these two guys in Seattle. And I contacted all these people, and none of them wanted to have any interaction with me. That was, yeah, I think to them it was just a business opportunity that failed. And they didn't really seek or even had any greater understanding of what they were involved in, which was the biggest bringing alternative energy to the American marketplace in Seattle. And all the stuff we were doing, that was the biggest what happened to us was the biggest free energy takedown ever, to my knowledge. And yeah, and nobody really wanted to know more, and yeah, I was trying to, benefit them, like, hey, look at what we were, this is what you were a part of. Wasn't that nice? And nobody wanted to hear it. So, and this was more of my lessons, many more of my lessons. So by October 87, over the previous 18 months, I'd either worked for free or lived off about $50 a week. And yeah, all I paid for that 18 months was food and gas. That was all I spent money on. And I lived with Dennis and his family for nearly a year, which was a highlight of my life. It really was. Yeah, living with them was a wonderful experience. I said, I'm Uncle Wade to their daughters, and yeah, it was wonderful. And ever since college, I never lived with a fastidious roommate. Yeah, the kitchens were always destroyed. It was always just filthy and stuff. And so I couldn't really use the kitchens, which was, I could get away with on a suboptimal diet in my 20s, but it was something that I wanted to be able to make my own meals, etc. And I really couldn't do it when the kitchen was just trashed. And Alice and Dennis were similar. Again, they were up to their eyeballs in busyness. And so, yeah, they weren't good housekeepers either. And so I finally, after how many years was that? It was several. It was several years of these kind of roommates. And I just, I asked Dennis, I said, now the money's pouring in, can I at least take enough of a salary to rent a room, like $300 a month or something, so I can rent a room? And Dennis said, oh, no problem. So I finally started taking that, and I called. I actually the local newspaper. I looked at a couple ads for renting a room. And this was another one of these larger than life events in my life, which I know this my otherworldly friends who are doing this. So actually, I made a couple phone calls. I think I did visit another house. I think I visited two homes, and that was it. So I visited two homes after calling. And I talked to this one woman, and it went well. And then she said, "And come over." And so I went over, and she opens the door. And this is the only time I've ever done this in my lifetime. She opens the door, and I look at her, and I go, "I know you from somewhere. I know you. I know who you are." And then, anyway, she had a disability, physical disability, and I looked and I said, "Oh, okay, I remember that." So I guess in my nerdish way, I don't think I know you. Well, that woman became my wife, and this was my friend setting me up. I know this was my friend setting me up, and in fact, I could go on about the ludicrous so-called coincidences around this. So Wade, who never wanted to live in Southern California again, who bounces around the country, this woman who became my wife lived 2 blocks from my first girlfriend. Yeah. it was all happened, which was one block from the college where, I learned under Wayne, etc. So this is all, another 2 blocks from my first big job that I had, another 2 blocks from the first job I ever had. Yeah, it's all. Uh, if I get reasonable about it, I really don't believe it, but it did happen. And so, anyway, so I moved in with her. And so she is recently divorced and she needed a roommate. So I became a roommate. In fact, there were 3 of us. And as I later realized, that was the beginning of the end of my days with Dennis. Yeah. So the woman who became my wife eventually gently extracted me from all that over years. It wasn't immediate, but that's ultimately what did happen. And I know that was my otherworldly friends at work. So compensation for my journey is how I look at that. So yeah, my sun rises and sets on my wife, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Um, Soon before Christmas '87, this is now in December of '87, one of our customers informed CAB that the Better Business Bureau was forwarding calls to them to the Ventura County Sheriff's Department about us. Anyway, so Cab calls him. He calls the sheriff's department and talks to the deputy who the calls are being forwarded to. And back this deputy, I call him Mr. Deputy in my work. And so the sheriff's deputy who's getting these calls from the Better Business Bureau, and Cab used to be a sheriff's deputy himself, and so he says, "Office deputy, Mr. Deputy, why is the Better Business Bureau forwarding calls about us to you? Are we doing something that we shouldn't be doing? Are we doing something illegal? What's going on?" And Mr. Deputy said, "Oh, no, it's just a routine kind of investigation, which I'm going to kind of wrap it up now. Yeah, nothing going on, really. It was, yeah, just a formality," which was a big lie, which was one of the many big lies. And this is the beginning of the criminality of the Ventura County officials, the gangster activities of the Ventura County officials. This was the first of the first act I know of definitely the gangster activity by the officials in Ventura County, which we'll soon see was on behalf of the global elite. But that'll come later. In fact, also just before Christmas, Dennis and his salesman pal, they're in the office one night drinking late into the night. And as I were in, the room I had was also only 10 minutes from the office. And so one evening around midnight, I drive to the office to go take Dennis home. And Dennis was a paraplegic anyway, so he could barely walk. So I'm like half carrying him to my car to take him home that night. And so as I'm helping him, to my car that's parked in the parking lot, Dennis stops and he goes, "Wait, look at this. Yeah, these 2 buildings, 9,000 square foot of buildings, 40 employees," and he's going, the guy that goes to Dennis called them the big boys. And at that point, I don't think we even thought in terms of global elite, but that's really who we were referring to, unbeknownst to us, really. But he goes, "Their eyes got to be bugging out seeing what we're doing." He goes, this has got to be scary to them seeing what we got going on right now. And I agreed. I was like, yeah, this is something. So back to I wanted to see a show. I was seeing the show. So I was seeing the show that I paid the price of admission to see this show. Watch Dennis build something from nothing like he did. It was amazing to witness that. One of the greatest privileges of my life was watching that. And it wasn't easy. But I remember thinking at that time that, yes, if they don't stop us soon, they may not be able to. And that was sadly prophetic. Sadly prophetic, which would be coming. Dennis held a Saturday morning shows at our facility in the machine shop. And so he would have, again, it'd be, this is when he kind of met the public or people who would come to see him. And people were coming from around the world actually to be at those Saturday shows. That deputy actually went to a Saturday show, again, incognito. So he never identified himself as us until Cab found out through the Business Bureau. So, man, I could tell story after story. I've done some of this in the past. And when one of the Saturday morning shows, a guy came to us who was a lawyer, attorney in Washington, D.C., who was actually personal friends with Edmund Meese, who was the Attorney General of the United States at the time. And he, he saw the ads and stuff, and he asked Edwin. He said, "Edwin, this Dennis guy, what do you know about him?" And Meese knew Dennis by name. And he said, "Dennis Lee, we have," and this is the Justice Department now, "we have investigated him thoroughly, more than once, and he is squeaky clean." And this attorney hands Dennis the check, the $10,000 check for 2 sets of kits, as he's saying, "squeaky clean." And this is relevant for later. So, yeah, so this is the kind of world I was living in at that time. Oh my. And so right after Christmas, at one of Dennis's Saturday morning shows in our machine shop, a guy came by, an inventor, and he left off his business plan. And so our researcher, I call him Mr. Researcher, he was evaluating. So Dennis did what he did when I met him in Seattle, which is, "Come on, all your inventors, I'll bring your pigs to market." So we were being inundated also with inventions. So inventors were sending us our inventions from around the world, and our researcher was assessing them. And Mr. Mentor also helped. And so what happened was this guy, this inventor, dropped off his business plan, and he had invented a hydraulic heat engine. Well, my mentor's engine was also a hydraulic heat engine. And this is back to my friends at work, right? So 2 hydraulic heat engines come to us. And this guy actually had he had taken millions of dollars and spent building prototypes of his, which, other than the company that stole my mentor's engine, we really hadn't developed. I said we were building a prototype, but we hadn't spent millions of dollars developing prototypes yet. This guy had. And so what happened was that, again, the researcher showed it to Dennis that this guy's got something. And so on New Year's Day, 1988, this guy, his name was Victor Fisher, he came to our office, and on the spot, Dennis hired him. And in fact, I cut him the check. $1,000. I think I cut him a $1,000 check, and Victor Fisher came aboard, and we started building Fisher's prototype also. And Dennis he was in orbit. Yeah, I had never seen him flying as high as when he was flying then. He was flying high, really high. And about a week after New Year's, Dennis was actually there was a free energy conference. Again, when I met Dennis, we had no idea it was a free energy field. Well, a year later, he's actually speaking at a free energy conference, and in Southern California, I think it was Temecula. And anyway, when Dennis speaks, the show's over. Yeah, he overwhelmed the conference. Dennis cut the biggest swath you could imagine. And then a couple of days later, we actually had Dennis called a meeting of all these kit buyers and national dealers, et cetera, to come in to Ventura to have another show. These greatest energy shows, right? They're different. They all are a little different. This was, I don't know. I don't know the number. Maybe I had been involved with a dozen shows by then. I don't know. But by that time, I was no longer towing around the demo units and this kind of stuff. I had other people doing that. And so, but anyway, at this show, there was, again, several hundred people. I'm going to say 400 people were there, some number like that. And also Mr. Deputy was there at that show. And they were demonstrating, they had a circuit that would reduce the electric draw by at least a third, I think. Yeah, it's energy saving technology. Not only the world's best heating system, again, this stuff was coming to us. So people were bringing us their technologies, etc. It was an amazing time. And that show was, again, we were flying. We were definitely flying. And Mr. Deputy was also in the audience for that show. Of course, again, he never introduced himself to us. But he attended that show. And the next day, he was readying the search warrant for the raid on our facilities that happened the day after that. And I didn't know it yet, but my life's worst year was about to begin. And that will come next. So that's all for now.